talking about learning, so we all learned something, and the school obviously is focused on learning, and over the past few months we've had some great conversations with parents and with each other about learning and how we learn best, and we've looked at different aspects of learning. We've looked at motivation, and we've looked at mindsets, and Teresa will talk more about that. But there's been sort of a natural trajectory where we're going deeper and deeper into ourselves in different ways. And you know, at school we pay a lot of attention to how people learn. And you know, there's a saying about teaching, that teaching is not a science, it's an art. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's something about what makes a great teacher that you can't always pinpoint. It's about the rapport and the passion that an educator brings to their area and how they interact with kids. That's not always easy to pin down, but it's a very important ingredient. We also know from research that teachers have the greatest impact on learning in school. There's lots of other things. We have the curriculum, we have resources, but in the end, the biggest impact comes from the teacher. So that's one kind of thing that we know from educational research has been shown over and over again to be true. So science is getting closer to the art of education. And we've actually been looking at different aspects of scientific research. And we see that it's having a real impact on what we do and helping us decide what we do with kids. So this is sort of the next step where we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about our brains and children's brains and how they develop, what we know to this point. And the caution is that there's a lot we don't know, obviously, but it's amazing how quickly we are learning more and more about the functioning of the brain. We can actually follow neurons in all kinds of ways now with new technology that we couldn't just a short time ago. We could compare different kinds of brains. I was looking at a video, I don't know if you've seen this, looking at British taxi drivers, London taxi drivers. Have anyone seen this research? And they actually were scanning their brains, and it turns out that a particular part of their brain connected with mapping is larger in London taxi drivers than it is in normal people. And what that tells us is that the brain can change, and does change constantly. So with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to Teresa, and we'll take a look at the brain a little bit more.
Thanks, Arnie. Good morning. Thanks for coming. Appreciate you taking time for a busy life. Just to recap and connect with what Arnie's saying, what we're trying to do in these series of talks that Rebecca and we've lost Carmen is someone. These two have really done an excellent job with the parent education, and this is a piece of the parent education, so it's been fun to collaborate with them and try to get at the beginning, what are parents interested, and then together how can we do some of this exploration and thinking together. So thank you for coming today. But we're always trying to come back and connect it to the mission, saying how does our mission really connect with the science and the research, and how are we always trying to reach the mission as we go forward. So last time, as Arnie mentioned, we talked a lot about mindset, and I see a lot of new faces, which is fantastic. So just to connect to that, is there's a big body of research that shows that your mindset, your attitude towards learning has a huge impact on how well you learn. So the difference between a growth mindset, meaning I can do anything, I just need to keep giving effort and it'll eventually happen, versus a fixed mindset saying, I'm not a language person, I'm not a math person, so it's giving up in advance. So that's kind of the mind part that we really dealt with last time, and we thought it would flow nicely into looking a bit more at the brain. We know the connection of the mind and the brain, and looking at neuroscience. So today, before we get started in looking at the brain, the neuroscience research, and the connections we're starting to make and think about in education, we're going to stop and just activate your own background knowledge, your own thinking. Just stop and think. How do you think you learn? If you had to say so, how do I learn? What would you say, and what makes you say that? What's your justification for your opinion about how you learn? And then just have a chat with someone next. Just turn and talk. How do we learn? How do you learn? How do people learn? And what makes you say that? Okay, try to finish up your sentence and then we're going to move on. Finish up your thought. Okay, anybody want to share? What are you thinking about? How do people learn?
Through experiences.
Experiences, okay. Observation. Repetition. I knew that I heard somewhere here there's a whole emotional thing. You have to be interested. Yeah, so you have to be interested, motivated. That was an earlier topic we had. Right, there's that purpose. It has to be, you have to have a reason to do it, to see the relevance of it. Anything else came up?
Relation with that another information that you have already.
Connecting to other information, yes, definitely, right. And the formula. So thinking about a system and how does it work, because then I can apply it here and transfer it to other situations. So thinking of things in generalization or systems thinking. Great. Again, just wanted to have us be thinking about learning because this is something as educators, teachers, schools, we wrestle with all the time. We read all the research, and what informs teaching comes from many, many places. It comes because everybody learns. Everybody's been through school. So we all come with opinions based on our experiences. Some of this is based on tradition. But what more and more in the last 20, 25 years, what we've been trying to do is not just be based on tradition and our own experiences, but really say, what does science tell us? What does the research tell us? And up to this point, we've done a lot. Earlier, it was behavioral science, then cognitive science, and now we're moving much more into the neuroscience research. It's tough in education because we're dealing with human beings. It's tough to do absolute science. It's tough to have a control group. Well, we're just going to not teach these kids for this year and then see what's the difference. So we're dealing with human beings and we don't want to hurt anybody. So research is always tough in education. So just things to keep in mind as we look at this type of research that's being done in education. Again, we consult and look at research that's done in many different areas. And sometimes, like we saw with mindset and motivation, sometimes this new research or different research, it either confirms what we've believed from other research or other practice, or sometimes it debunks. It says, you know what, we had that wrong. We really didn't. We had some misconceptions about motivation. We had misconceptions about learning in terms of mindset. So this is what's happened in neuroscience. Some of it's confirming what we've known for a long time, and some of it's saying, maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe we need to look at this again. So without further ado, as we go through, like last time, as you're going through here, and it's a short video, and some of you have already seen it, what are you connecting to? What's making sense with what you were just thinking about, what you believe about learning? What's some new thinking that you're getting? It's connecting and extending your thinking a bit. What are you struggling with? What do you find challenging or you have questions about? So just be thinking about those three things as you watch the video again, and then we'll debrief after. Okay?
So how do we optimize learning? How do we make it so that what we do in a classroom is really the best thing we can be doing given what we know about the brain? So there are many ideas out there. For example, listening to classical music. Does that actually make a child smarter? The answer turns out to be no. Simply listening to music does not change anything about how a kid turns out. With one exception, it turns out that kids who listen to classical music might be more prone to take up playing a musical instrument, and that ends up enhancing a child's intelligence. Why? Well, to play a musical instrument well requires a lot of practice and concentration, and these are skills that are useful for becoming a good learner, for being able to pay attention to something for a sustained period of time. This is, of course, one of the challenges for all of us in this digital age, is how to sustain attention for a period of time, because there are so many pulls on our entertainment time at this point. And so this is one of the things that's important to teach to children. Now, the main way that learning gets into the brain is by engagement in the material. The ancient Greeks had noted this, that in order to retain any information, you really have to be curious about it. You need to care about it in some way. And this is the sort of central point that we always need to be thinking about when we're teaching, is how do we engage the students? So anytime we're just telling them material to memorize, it's more of a challenge to make them engaged. And so the trick for all of us is to figure out what can we do to make it interactive and emotionally salient and memorable to them. That's the way to get information into the brain. And I think we have lots of opportunities now in this era that we never had before by leveraging adaptive software and other educational games that keep a student right at his or her point of struggle where things are frustrating but achievable, and they can level up as they achieve the next step and so on. That's a real opportunity for us to take advantage of that, because really the way classrooms run typically is it's going too fast for half the kids and too slow for the other half of the kids. So anytime there's a way to leverage the opportunities around us to make it more customized for each child, then that's a great thing for us to take advantage of. And the way to do that, I think, is with software that essentially puts a different spin on what you're trying to teach. So for example, with mathematics, some kid is going to love baseball, and that's the way he's going to get into math, is by trying to understand the baseball statistics. Someone else is going to love space and the planets, and that's the way to get her into math, is by giving her some game that involves that, and so on. And we have this opportunity now, instead of giving every kid the same homework, instead to say, look, your homework tonight is to get 2 levels up from where you are right now in the game, irrespective of where each child is individually. So many people wonder about this idea that they've heard that the right and the left halves of the brain are very different from one another, and that you're a right brain thinker or a left brain thinker. And it turns out that the 2 halves of the brain are more similar than they are different. So it's a little bit of a misconception to think that the right and left halves are somehow fundamentally different. It is true that the left half is more involved in language and in fine motor skills, and the right half is slightly more involved in certain emotional issues and things like understanding music. But, as I said, it's really about the balance of the left and right activity rather than an all or none issue. And so when we talk about somebody being a left or right brain thinker, that's probably a misconception that doesn't do us any good and would be better off left to the side. Young brains are the most able to take in new information, to absorb that. But it turns out that that sort of brain plasticity is not just for the young, it's retained throughout life. And in fact, one of the most important things as people get older and older is to keep their brains physically active. Because by doing so, they're always building new roadways in their brain. They're always finding new ways to solve problems. And one of the problems that people get as they age is that parts of the brain might start to degenerate. They start the tissue actually starts to die. And so by keeping cognitively fit, you're always building new roadways, and you can continue to solve problems that way. So it's of utmost importance, just like any muscle in your body, to use it so that you don't lose it.
So quickly, just to process a little bit and think about what you just heard. It's a lot to take in a short period of time. What did you connect to? What did you say, yeah, I already do that. Yeah, we were just talking about engagement. We were just talking about you really care about it. What took you a little bit further, and what are you struggling with right now? Just have a chat with someone next to you. Extended your thinking, and what are you struggling with?
It's not about
They can if they want. So that's it. I don't know. Language, so it's really hard.
So what bubbled up? what rose to the discussion, what came to the front?
Challenge about concentration.
I agree.
Being focused.
And I think he made a nice point that in this day and age, it's hard for all of us.
Yeah.
Even if some of us had no problem focusing in school, I get distracted. Yeah, I start reading an article, then I'm over here. It is a huge challenge.
But do you think distraction is a new thing? Were we distracted in school?
These didn't exist. We were distracted in a different way.
Uh-huh.
We were distracted by other things. Yeah.
Okay.
Now
It's
you
a
can
new
sit with
level
this,
of
and an hour
distraction.
later you're like, an hour just passed, and what did I just do? Yeah.
So maybe you could be distractible, but there are more gadgets, toys, internet that make it easier for all of us to be distracted. For example, you're reading something online and then you see a link, right?
Yeah,
What do you do?
yeah.
You click on that link
And I think that that's some of the work in the mindfulness work or working with kids in advisory. What are some techniques that we can use to help hold our focus and attention? And really teaching them explicitly in this day. Sure, what else bubbled
The
up?
other thing is that they can is how much interest they have, but how much ability they have as well. If they are better at solving maths, they're more likely to be interested in the subject. If they struggle and they're challenging with it, it's more difficult to motivate them, to get them to do their homework or to be concentrating in the class. So I think some of them can be really good at one topic and not so great at another topic. So it's like you're saying, it's finding that balance, and that for me is a challenge to find out like what are they more interested and have a better ability to do.
So you brought in about 3 of the main points that we talked about, and they're intertwined, right? That whole interest, the learners have to see the relevance. And this is something we're really trying to work on with teachers, is how can we keep the learning as authentic for the children, for the learners, as possible. Because if they see the authenticity, they see the relevance for themselves, they're much more likely to engage with it. The other point you made is how challenging it is. And I liked what he brought up because this actually confirms something we've known for decades from Vygotsky. Vygotsky was a big theorist, educational researcher and theorist, who said we need to have kids at that key point. For maximum learning, they have to be challenged, but not too much, because they'll get too frustrated or it's too easy, they're not learning anything. So that's always a challenge for us when we have many, many children together, is to try to make it happen that they're right at their perfect zone, that perfect point of challenge, because otherwise we will lose them, as you say. But as he mentioned, we're very lucky right now because of some of the IT tools that we have more possibility and more ease to do that. We just have to learn and adapt the way we do things. So
What
good,
I would
good
add,
points, yeah.
one point I would add is you're talking about the question of ability. I think the truth is, ability is definitely not black and white, and we develop in different ways at different times. And it isn't even necessarily true that because you're very good at something, that's what you're necessarily interested in. We see students who are excellent in a certain area, but that's not their passion, it doesn't really drive them. So certainly being good at something helps in the sense that it paves the way. Although sometimes you'll see students who are not challenged because it comes easy to them, but then when they hit a roadblock, they really stumble because they're so used to just flowing along. So I do think the point about engagement, and it's part of our mission as well, figuring out ways to really engage kids and for them to feel connected to the learning and interested is the key way, whatever their ability level, that will help them get better at all they do.
Nice connection to the mindset. I mean, nothing's fixed, and he brought that up too, the plasticity of the brain can always change. We have to just find the ways. Yes?
I struggle a little bit with always catering to the child's interests. For example, picking out my daughter's IB classes. Like, she doesn't want any parts of history. Doesn't want any, so there's no history in her program. And that bothers me. I think she should know history. And she won't be able to get away with that in the States, but she can get away with it here with the IB program, and that's the way it's going to be. But is that good, that she's not going to have any history? I mean, I guess she'll get it in college, but, so how much do we cater to the kids' interests?
Right. Well, I think the point there is it's really connected to how the IB works. So kids are in 11th and 12th grade when they do the International Baccalaureate Diploma program. And at that point, they're given different areas of study that they're more interested in and they want to focus on and maybe take with them after they graduate. So within the area of history, there's also psychology, there's economics, so there's all kinds of other areas of interest, and at that point developmentally, it does make sense to have that focus. If we really work with kids about how to learn about anything, whether it's history or anything else, then they'll take that with them for the rest of their lives. So the concern for us is not so much about whether they're doing history in 11th and 12th grade, but if they've gotten the preparation they need to be learners for life and to be curious about history and know how to learn more about it. Because you always have to make choices, especially in this day and age, right? I mean, there's so much choice, there's so much information. Really, one of the challenges for us is how do you sift through, how do you use all of that information that's in front of you, as opposed to a particular subject like history or whatever the area is. So I guess the belief is at that point, there's more of a focus on their level of interest, and the idea of the IB is that it's holistic, so they're studying they've chosen a certain science, they've chosen a certain social area, they've chosen a certain kind of mathematics, and they're putting that together as they move into adulthood.
Okay. Anybody else want to add to that or respond to that? Yes?
So it's something I've been thinking about is that here we are always talking about making fun for the kids, making interesting, which is important for the learners. My worry is when I see my kids are here for a longer time, that then sometimes in life you need to do things what are not fun.
Right.
You just need to do them, to learn them. Even they are not fun, and even you don't even see the result for that moment. You know, and you can try to explain on examples why they need it later, but it doesn't come in that age for them. But even like that, they need to learn it, and that's my worry. That then, once comes the things that are not that fun, that are not that interesting, they're just going to say, well, I don't need to do that, and
Right.
we just focus on the things that are fun and interesting. So, what I am worried is that balance
Right.
between, you know, what you should learn or you need to learn for your life. And even when you talk about history, like, I believe people should have some general education. You know, like I have kids younger, but like talking about geography or basic history, I believe that when you say they should know, connect, you know, about stuff, about when you say Paris, they should at least say it's Europe, you
Right.
know, and it's not. It's basic learning, like memorized. It's not something that you should. You can do it in a fun way, but it's memorized. And I feel here that it's kind of losing the balance, and that's my worry.
Well, I think those are great points, and we believe that knowledge, basic knowledge, is important because if you don't have a foundation, you can't apply it to other kinds of thinking. So there's always that push and pull in the sense that there's too much information for any of us to grasp. So we have to have the skills of understanding how to make sense of everything that's out there, know how to use it, know where to go to find it, all of those kinds of things. There are also fundamentals that are important, but even there, you need to understand the concepts behind it. So we know, for example, just simply memorizing the multiplication table, let's use that as an example. There's importance in having certain foundational skills in mathematics, but if you don't understand the concepts behind how does 5 times 7 equals 35, what does that mean? If you don't understand it, then actually you can't use math to problem solve. So you need to have basic foundational information, but you have to understand the concepts. In terms of the question of hard work and challenge, we believe that we want to challenge kids. We want kids to feel challenged, and it's not always easy. I can promise you, kids in the IB, whatever subjects they're taking, they are being challenged. It's a very difficult time for 11th and 12th graders, and even earlier. There's a lot of challenge, but we want to make the challenge as engaging as possible. So I'll ask you all a simple question. How many of you studied geometry in school? Okay. How many of you remember or apply geometry. And the point I'm making about that is that often what happens in schools traditionally, or what has happened, is that you have a curriculum and you would cover, and we call it teaching by mentioning. So, okay, I've covered that, check the box, move on to the next thing. I've taken the test, I've studied hard for that test, I got an A on the test, and then the next day, it's gone, because there's no connection to what I've learned. So, the point is that we need to make the learning connected and engaging. So it's really a combination of those two. It's not one or the other, but we have to remember what the higher purpose is.
And I would just like to distinguish personally, I think there's a difference between fun and engaging. Because I can be very engaged in something and not necessarily say it's fun. And I can have fun times and just be super engaged. So for us, engagement is really being there, really thoroughly engaged. I know why I'm doing this, I'm interested, there's sustained focus. That's the engagement, I think. So I think we need to be careful about fun versus engagement. Here we're really talking about we need to make sure they're engaged. Because we can fake engagement too. I've done it. I do it in some meetings. I can fake engagement without a problem. My mind is
That explains a lot.
And I think, to come back, I think Arnie used the word concept. And I think that's more and more because of the explosion of information. We're in an international school representing 60-some countries. When you talk about history, whose history do you study? You know, I look back, I took an entire year of World War II in high school. It was fascinating, I had no problem. But think about all the things I didn't learn, right? And I didn't learn it conceptually. I didn't learn what, for example, revolutions in general, or freedom in general, and then look at multiple examples around the world. That's where we're trying to go with that very specific subject area, is say conceptually, when people struggle for freedom. Let's look at different times and places in history and then make generalizations so we have a system for looking when things happen in the world. So again, we have to be careful with discrete knowledge versus can we hook it in this framework of conceptual understanding so then I can use it to understand when things are happening in Kiev right now. Can I then apply what I understand? So that's specific to history.
But let me give you a concrete, that's a really good example, because the kids in 8th grade, any of you have 8th graders right now? 8th graders are doing a revolution unit. So what does that mean? We're going to have, it's not simply, we're going to overthrow our parents. No, but the idea is we're studying revolutions. The kids are studying revolutions. Different revolutions are given choice. They're given areas of information where they can go and do research. But what are they doing with that information? So one of the things they have to do is that every student needs to write a revolutionary speech. But that speech has very clear criteria. They have to draw on real facts. If they're talking about the Ukraine, and the kids are studying, a lot of the kids chose the Ukraine because it's happening now. Isn't that wonderful that they can actually go deeply? They have to understand the history of the Ukraine. They have to understand the history of the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia. They have to look at the different figures involved and were they elected, were they dictators, what's really going on. So all of the things that we think is important about history, they're required to look at because they can't really write a speech unless they can draw on those facts. So it's an example of an engaging activity. I promise you they're going to remember that. And then they can also look at other kinds of activities or other kinds of historical events and remember how they applied it in that case. So that's an idea of how we want to engage kids in learning.
I just wanted to make some funny example. When I was at school in England, you've never had this kind of more diverse teaching, and it was really quite strict, and it was repetition.
Yes.
And it was like a complete different way. Engagement wasn't really about engagement or more school uniforms and stuff. You know, it was a completely different thing. But I remember I had an exam on religious studies because, and I'm not a religious person, but I wrote about my interest, which was like Nelson Mandela at the time, and freedom, and I actually got like 100% on this exam because it was the only moment where I had space to express myself.
Right.
Because in school, when we didn't have that opportunity at all. It was ticking as you go along, and that was it. So I really appreciate that side of it because I think there's an expectation from parents what they want their children to learn. And then when you come to these seminars or when you think deeper, you do understand the bigger picture of what we are trying to teach them. So
that's a great anecdote.
So yes, would you kind of say that then in education in general, what you're saying is that content is not as important as the approach to learning and the techniques involved?
What I would say is that content is something that you use. It's not the driver.
Right.
You don't have content for the sake of content. So what is content in history? What is content in science? The parts of the cell, that's content. But if you just discretely know the parts of the cell, you don't understand the functioning and you don't understand how it interacts, how useful information, and will you retain that information? So the content is important, but in service of applying concepts and using that information, not in and of itself. It's not, you know, it's like Jeopardy. You guys know the show Jeopardy. It's an American show where you have to basically recall facts. That's great. So having that recall is great in that environment, but that's not really what's going to help you be successful in life.
And I think we have to be careful about content, because many people have different understandings of what that means. What we're trying to distinguish the difference between discrete knowledge and conceptual understanding.
Right.
So these understandings that are transferable from one situation to the next, that we can then, like Arnie said, is applied.
I have a comment, maybe it's borderline to the conference, but sometimes I struggle between what today's environment here in ISP is and how the kid will be able to transfer it to a complete different environment,
Right.
like you mentioned the British one or the French one, because we are crazy about memorizing things. And how, you know, because here it's a big freedom of thinking and putting things together, and you go back eventually at one point to a more strict system, and I'm a bit, you know,
Yeah.
worrying about
That's a
about
good
this.
question. So if I can just say it
How
another
do we
way.
prepare these kids
Right.
who are maybe not lifetimes through ISP to be able to swap, or international school, to swap from one system to another?
And most of our students are not at ISP for their lifetime. They're often going to another international school, or they're going back to their own national systems. Our experience anecdotally tells us that kids are successful going back to the States or to Belgium, wherever they go. They tend to do well because, you know, we're not losing sight of having this foundational knowledge. It's how it is structured and how they use it that's important. So it's not that they don't have math skills, but they have a deeper understanding of math skills. For example, and we do some external testing where we compare our students in mathematical literacy, in reading and different kinds of writing against thousands of students around the world from grade 3 through grade 9.
Yeah, but they're all in international school.
Well, actually, that's not quite true.
Oh, okay.
So that test, it's called the International Schools Assessment. It does two things. It compares our students to about 40,000 international students around the world in all regions in these areas, in kinds of testing that we think mirrors what we want to teach in the school, but in mathematics, reading, and writing. The 9th grade exam is also normed against the PISA exam, which is the Program for International Student Assessment, and that is the one where you see all of these different countries represented. I'm sure you've seen it where Finland or Korea or the United States, it's like 50 different countries. And there we see how our 9th graders compare to students in Korea or Japan or Belgium or the United States or the UK in these areas. So it does give us some comparison about where are our students in comparison with their peers, even in their own home countries. And again, generally, not surprisingly, they score quite high because they're being compared to their peers in a broader way. So that's not surprising to us, but it does give us some kind of benchmark. But as I said, in addition, we know, and because we hear from families, generally, when kids go back to their own systems, they seem to be successful.
I'd just like to tell a story of a kid who was here who was British. And the kid was in another school and very unhappy, and they didn't know what to do with him. And they said, well, we can send him back to boarding school in England, or we can put him in ISP. Heaven forbid ISP, the loosey-goosey American system. And then they thought about it, and they really didn't want to be without him for that year. So they put him in ISP. And the kid was extremely happy, loved it. And then they went back to England the next year, and these people wanted their kid to be in the best school in London. And he tested him fine. He had no problem adjusting.
Which grade?
This was 3rd to 4th grade. And so that's just an anecdote.
Right.
That I think that part of the point of ISP is teaching kids how to learn, so when they go into a different environment, they can learn. It's not only exclusive for this environment, but that's the whole point of this, is that these are all international kids, and they're going to go God knows where they're going to end up, and that they will be successful there. And I think I think the experience of ISP getting so many people into good universities and the kids succeed there is one. But obviously it's not always perfect. But
We're all different.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to tell another story, an anecdote as well. We had some Dutch twins, some of you may remember, Marit and Barrett, and they went to France to a more traditional or international school. So I'm going to respond to your question. When they came back to visit last June, their mother said to me, one of them was thriving in the French traditional school, and the other one was struggling, not academically. They were both doing quite well academically, but it can be challenging to go from an environment where you're encouraged to ask lots of questions, where you're encouraged to think and have an opinion, and go back into a system where that isn't encouraged. I wouldn't want to mislead anyone. I had that experience with my daughter as well. That said, their mother said to me, I'm just so grateful they had their time at ISP and they learned to think. So even if they don't have as much opportunity to think now, that's not something they're going to lose.
I have an anecdote the other way. We just moved here, and my daughter's in the 10th grade. And she comes from a very traditional private Catholic school system in the United States. Traditional. And so when we go back to the States or we see people, first thing out of their mouth said, my daughter is, how do you like your school? Is it easy or hard? And she says, it's neither. She says, it's just different, and I love it. She just says it's different. That's all. That's the only thing I can get out of her. It's just different.
Well, it's usually what people say. I mean, I'm a graduate from this International American Systems, what do you say as well? And people from France or Sweden, everybody, they always ask me, well, what's the difference between, you know, the regular, strict, whatever type of education, international schools? And I say, well, in a nutshell, the international schools say, you know, 2 + 2 is 4, but why is it 4? And the kids get to think about it and get to ask questions and get to give their understanding. So in a nutshell, that's what's the difference is. Yeah. But that's always what I say.
You're still learning 2 + 2 is 4.
Yeah, exactly. You're still learning it, but why is it 4? Not just it's 4 and that's it. You just have to know it's 4 and move on. But it's actually learning why is it 4. And so yeah, it's just an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, and a couple of things to build on that. I think international students become very flexible.
Oh yeah.
And thinkers and adapting, and it's a huge life skill. And that's what I've seen in multiple international schools, is that's a huge gift. Because they're going to be able to deal with people from around the world and different systems and adapt very, very well. The second thing, I think you need to realize also in the national systems, in the UK, some in France, some in Belgium, the national systems are trying some very progressive things because they realize that they need to change as well. So these changes are happening in national systems. I don't think international systems are super avant-garde or super progressive. We're just keeping up with the research and trying to be very thoughtful about it. But it's happening in national levels as well. So I just want to make sure that we don't categorize international schools as being progressive. Okay? Yeah. Sure.
So we always like to connect back to the mission of the school because we really use the mission all the time. For us, it's kind of a standard by which we measure ourselves against, and we want that to be the case for you as well. When we talk about being compassionate or respectful, or having integrity, for example, having those values, that's what you should expect of us. And the same thing about engagement, empowerment, inspiration. That's the kind of learning environment we want to create, because we know that that's how people learn best. And thankfully, you heard the speaker on the video talk about engagement. Thankfully, we were wise enough, I guess, to create a mission that really has the foundations of learning in it. And obviously, they're very broad statements, but they're very, very important to us. And so when we look at our curriculum, when we look at our standards in any particular area, when we look at how we teach and how we work with kids, we think about these kinds of concepts, engagement. We describe some engaging activities or learning ways kids are learning. And we talk about authentic, the fact that the learning should not be in silos, you know, where, okay, now I'm learning about history and now I'm learning about science. That's not how people learn in the real world. As someone said, Kevin was talking to faculty just the other day, I think it was yesterday. He said, you know, when you look at a tree, you don't have a science tree or a math tree. All of those things are interconnected to the real world. So we want the learning, we want these different areas, these different disciplines to be interconnected. When you work as a historian in the real world, of course you think about geography, of course you think about economics. So the authenticity, the real world connections is very important, and that also makes it engaging. And purposeful means that there's a clear focus in what we're doing, and we want kids leaving ISP to feel like purposeful people, that they have a sense as to where they're going. They understand themselves, they understand how they learn, they understand what's important to them, and they have a direction. So all of those kinds of things that we heard about, what we know about the brain to date, is very much linked to the mission of the school. And finally, as we said at the beginning, I want to be really clear, there's so much we don't know, and we're learning every day about the brain and how people learn best. And this doesn't only apply to kids, it applies to all of us. I think we were all very happy to hear that we don't stop learning, and that the brain doesn't stop changing, right? And so our brains are plastic, they continually change, and when you focus in a particular area, like playing a musical instrument, that does activate your brain, and actually, when you learn and do different kinds of things, the shape of your brain actually changes, even for us old folks. And Jay, you have some... Sorry.
I have a question about when he was talking about specific programs, for example, to learn math with the student that likes the basketball, you know, and the one that likes astronomy. Is he talking about specific applications? I mean, you know, to give each child different homework and to get to those types of levels, but he's talking about programs that are already there as...
You mean tech programs? Yeah. There are definitely programs, apps, technology that focus in different areas. That there's a whole science of gaming, and you know we all worry about games.
Exactly.
In fact,
that's a bit what I'm wondering.
there's a lot of research that shows that games improve lots of skills as well. So don't, on the one hand, you don't want anyone addicted to something.
But yeah, and I think we have to uncover why that is, and in gaming why it is these programs are adaptive. What that means is I do with this, if it's too hard, it adjusts, and it makes it a little easier. But if I'm successful, then it nudges me up. It's that point he was trying to make. It gets rid of that perfect zone.
But this is being brought to the classrooms. They're using these...
More and more that is happening.
More and more technology is adaptive, and I think that's where we're trying to look for those resources so that kids can interact, especially the homework. We were just talking with the modern language teachers yesterday about trying to leverage more technology in this way so that's more adaptive and more engaging. And I think that's some of what underlies the research in gaming. So just a couple quick announcements, and then we will stay around and talk as long as you want, but we try to close the official part up and can read the brain thing in here. Okay, just so you know, we are planning on hosting a brain conference here at ISP. You've probably seen it in the parent contact on the 25th and 26th. And we encourage you to take a look at the program, see if there's anything that interests you, and you're welcome to